Hello. A few weeks ago, someone asked me who was my favourite preacher, and immediately I thought of Iron Morgan, and I did a little video about Iron a couple of weeks back, which is on my YouTube channel. Uh, Iron of blessed memory, extraordinary preacher. Another name that occurred to me was the name of this man, Ian Macpherson. So I thought, since I am on this line of thought, I would continue with it. Ian Macpherson. I remember hearing him preach when I was a teenager, and I was with a friend of mine, and we were so stunned by his ministry, by the power of his presentation, by the construction of his words, by his thought processes, by the challenge of his preaching, that when we came out of the service, we both said to each other, if ever I become a preacher, I want to be a preacher like Ian Macpherson. I want to be a preacher like this man. He was amazing. His sermons were powerful and beautiful because he was a writer too, and his sermons were works of literature, really were. In the course of my ministry, I had many of his books. I had a book called The Burden of the Lord, which was a powerful book, an instructive book for ministers. A book called The Art of Illustrating Sermons, which was a wonderful book for a preacher. It gave you so many interesting thought processes to pursue about the interesting subject of illustrating a sermon. And then there were books of sermons, God's Middleman, This Man Loved Me, None Other Name. Those were books that I devoured and enjoyed. And then he produced a book of theology, Contending for the Truth, and lots of other books that he authored along the way. And so he was a great writer, a beautiful writer, constructing the sentences and the words and the phrases so powerfully. And that's how he preached, because he preached without notes. He preached from memory, having written a script, then he committed that script to memory, and it flowed out of him so beautifully and so powerfully. I was privileged to be just a few miles from him when I was ministering in North Wales, in Prestatyn, and he was at Rhyl. At first he was the minister of a church in Rhyl, and then he retired to Rhyl and became the editor of the Prophetic Witness magazine. And I saw him from time to time, invited him to my church, and he came along and preached for me sometimes. I also met him with George Stormont, who was preaching for me one weekend, and he said, I'd love to see my old friend Ian Macpherson. Do you know where he lives? I said, I do. I can take you to him. And so I was privileged, this young man wet behind the ears, listening to these two great men, deep in conversation about spiritual matters, about the challenge of Christian leadership. It was wonderful just to be there with a listening ear. I once caught a bus along the North Wales coast, and I didn't catch many buses, but I jumped onto this bus. Before I caught the bus, I picked up a book from my bookshelf. It was called The Art of Illustrating Sermons by Ian Macpherson, and I was sitting reading the book, dipping into it and enjoying it, when somebody got on the bus, and I thought to myself, very antisocial, I hope they don't sit next to me. It was getting a bit crowded. And yes, they did sit next to me. And when I looked up, it was him. It was Ian Macpherson. Honestly, not a word of a lie. What an extraordinary coincidence. And I said, oh my goodness, I'm reading your book. And he smiled and we laughed together. And I got the chance to ask him about his writing, how he constructed his books. At the same time, he was writing a book on theology. And so he shared with me some of the ways in which he approached his writing, and how he planned it, and how he laid it out, and how he fulfilled the task of writing. And so it was an interesting journey on the bus with Ian Macpherson sitting. I couldn't believe it. I'm reading your book, I said. And it gave me a wonderful illustration too, of course, because one day, when the Lord comes, when he is suddenly there, if we are reading his book, if we are filling our minds and hearts with his truth, then we'll be ready to welcome him, ready to converse with him and take delight in such conversation with the living Lord. And so that was an opportunity to grab an illustration when I was reading a book about illustrations. And so extraordinary man and wonderful, encouraging preacher. He preached from memory. In his later years, he couldn't quite remember sometimes, because it wasn't that he was just drawing upon his vocabulary, he was drawing upon his memory every time he preached. And so he said to me one occasion when he'd come to preach for me, I'm quitting. I can't remember anymore. I'm just going to devote myself to my writing. I can't. He was so disappointed when he had to leave that tremendous level of revelation in his preaching that came out of his memory, came out of research, came out of his study and his prayer life, and had to come down just to talking to people. And so he wanted to devote himself to his writing. In conversation one day with him, I said, one of the things I remember, and I shared with him from one of his books, one of the things that he'd written, and it had been important to me, special to me, precious to me. And he said, it's funny, isn't it, that you pick on that to tell me that that's how you remember me, because of that piece of writing. It's strange what people remember. He said, I remember when I was at the height of my preaching in Glasgow, when I was a minister of a church in Glasgow. And one of the women said to me, what I will always remember about you is not your preaching, but your praying. I remember every time I came into the church, there you were at the front of the church, kneeling in prayer. That's what I remember about you. He said, I was at the height of my preaching, and yet what she remembered was me kneeling down at the front of the church, where the soles of my shoes exposed as I knelt before God in prayer. She remembered his praying. Well, to be remembered as a man of prayer, rather than a man of proclamation, is no bad thing, because if we don't pray, we will not preach successfully. If our life is not soaked in prayer, then our preaching will not be as powerful and as clear and as strong, as persuasive and as challenging as it otherwise could be. And so she remembered him as a man of prayer rather than a man of preaching. Well, I remember him primarily as a preacher, an encourager, someone who was always ready to speak words of wisdom. When you talked with him, there were always words of wisdom. And I loved his preaching. I'll never forget it. And I thank God for him, for Ian McPherson of blessed memory. Thanks for listening.